In 1902, the most powerful empire on earth sent warships, soldiers, and diplomats to a small corner of South America, not for gold, not for land, but to stop a railway. That railway was going to connect two oceans, reshape global trade, and break the financial grip that Britain had quietly held over the world for more than 100 years. Welcome to True Earth History, where hidden history comes to life. Subscribe to uncover the truth behind the headlines. To understand why Britain feared one railway so deeply, you have to understand what Britain actually was at the start of the 20th century. Britain was not just a country. It was the financial engine of the entire world, controlling shipping routes, insurance markets, and international lending on a scale no nation had ever achieved before. The City of London was the center of global money. Every major trade deal, every government loan, every cargo shipment moved through British financial networks. Britain did not need to own every country. It simply needed to control the roads, the ports, and the money that made those countries function. And for nearly 2 centuries, that system had worked perfectly, making Britain the richest and most influential power on the planet. But by 1900, something was changing. New industrial nations were rising. The United States, Germany, and Japan were building factories, railways, and navies of their own. Britain was no longer the only game in town. And the people who ran the British Empire knew it. They could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. In South America, a man named Percival Farquhar had a vision that terrified them more than any army could. Farquhar was an American engineer and businessman, born in Pennsylvania in 1864, who believed that South America was the most underdeveloped and most valuable continent on the face of the earth. He was not wrong. The Amazon basin alone held more rubber, timber, minerals, and agricultural land than most countries could dream of in a lifetime. But the Amazon had one brutal problem. The Madeira River, one of its greatest tributaries, had 19 waterfalls and rapids that made navigation completely impossible for long stretches. Those falls were not just a natural obstacle. They were a wall that kept the wealth of Bolivia and western Brazil locked away from the rest of the world. Bolivia at that time was a landlocked nation, desperate for a way to export its rubber, which was worth enormous amounts of money during the rubber boom of the early 1900s. Bolivian rubber was some of the finest in the world, but getting it out of the jungle and to international markets was nearly impossible without a way around those falls. Farquhar proposed something that most people thought was madness. He would build a railway through the Amazon jungle, running alongside the Madeira River Falls, connecting the rubber regions to the coast. This railway would be called the Madeira to Mamor Railway, and it would run 364 kilometers through some of the most dangerous jungle terrain on the face of the earth. The idea had been discussed for decades. Portugal had considered it. Brazil had studied it. Bolivia had begged for it. But no one had ever actually built it. The jungle defeated every attempt. The heat, the disease, the floods, and the sheer remoteness of the region made construction almost unthinkable for most engineering companies of that era. But Farquhar was different. He had already built railways and infrastructure across Cuba, Guatemala, and other parts of Latin America with remarkable speed and determination. And he had something more important than engineering skill. He had access to capital, American capital. And that was the problem that made Britain very nervous indeed. By 1907, Farquhar had secured contracts, hired engineers, and begun assembling the largest private workforce ever seen in the Amazon region up to that point in history. Workers arrived from more than 50 countries. There were men from Barbados, Bolivia, Spain, Portugal, Bulgaria, and dozens of other nations, all drawn by the promise of wages in the jungle. The conditions they found when they arrived were beyond anything most of them had imagined. The Amazon jungle in that region was not just wild, it was deadly in ways that science was only beginning to understand. Malaria, yellow fever, and a disease called blackwater fever killed workers at a rate that shocked even the most experienced engineers on the project. One early construction attempt in the 1870s by an American company called Collins and Over End had already ended in catastrophe, with dozens of workers dead and the project completely abandoned. That first attempt left behind a grim reputation. Local people called the stretch of jungle along the railway route the Devil Road, and the name was not an exaggeration. Some historical accounts suggest that for every sleeper laid on that railway, one worker died. Whether exact or approximate, the human cost of building through that jungle was staggering. But Farquhar pressed forward. He believed the economic prize was worth the cost, and he had investors and governments depending on him to deliver. Back in London, British financial institutions were watching every development with growing anxiety. This railway was not just an infrastructure project. It was a direct challenge to their economic control of the region. Britain had long dominated South American trade through its merchant shipping lines, which controlled the ports and coastal routes that all exports passed through to reach European and global markets. If Farquhar connected the Bolivian rubber regions directly to the Brazilian coast by rail, he would reduce the dependency on British shipping routes that had made London rich for generations. American goods, American financing, and American infrastructure would flow into South America in ways that bypassed British banks and British ships entirely. This was the moment that Britain truly began to fear the railway, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented, which was the beginning of the end of British financial dominance in Latin America. British diplomatic cables from this period, now available in historical archives, show that officials in London were carefully monitoring Farquhar and his project with deep concern and careful strategic planning. Britain could not simply stop a private railway project in Brazilian territory by force. That would cause an international incident and damage the diplomatic relationships Britain depended on across the continent. So Britain did what powerful empires have always done when they cannot act openly. They worked through influence, finance, and carefully placed pressure at every level of the project. British banking houses that had long relationships with Brazilian and Bolivian governments began quietly raising concerns about the financial stability of the Farquhar enterprise. Loans that had seemed available began to disappear. Credit lines that had been promised were suddenly reviewed. The cost of financing the railway kept rising in unexpected ways. At the same time, British rubber interests in Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaya, were being quietly expanded and accelerated with government support and preferential access to colonial infrastructure. The goal was to flood the global market with cheap plantation rubber from British colonial territories, destroying the value of wild Amazonian rubber before Farquhar could get his railway running. This strategy had been developing since the 1870s, when a British botanist named Henry Wickham had removed thousands of rubber tree seeds from Brazil under circumstances that Brazil considered deeply improper. Those seeds were taken to Kew Gardens in London, germinated, and then sent to British colonies in Asia, where they were grown on large organized plantations with controlled labor and enormous scale. By 1910, British colonial rubber plantations in Malaya and Ceylon were beginning to produce rubber at a cost far below what wild Amazon rubber could ever match. The economics of the Amazonian rubber trade began to collapse. The rubber boom that had made the project financially viable was ending faster than anyone had predicted. Workers in the Amazon, who had earned good wages tapping wild rubber trees, were suddenly finding that their product was worth less and less with each passing season. The grand cities that rubber had built in the Amazon, including Manaus with its famous opera house, began to feel the quiet desperation of a boom that was turning into a crash. Farquhar was caught between a dying industry and an unfinished railway, but he refused to stop. He had spent too much, sacrificed too much, and believed too deeply in the project to walk away. By 1912, the railway was almost complete, despite the deaths, the disease, the financial pressure, and the deliberate undermining from powerful interests. The tracks were nearly all laid. The workers who survived had done something extraordinary. They had built a functional railway through one of the most hostile environments on Earth, connecting regions that had been isolated for centuries. The first locomotive to run the full length of the completed line in 1912 was a moment of genuine triumph for engineering, for human determination, and for the idea that nothing is impossible with enough will. But the rubber market had already collapsed. The product the railway was designed to carry was no longer worth what it had once been. The economic logic that had driven the project no longer existed. Farquhar had built his railway, but the world it was built for had already changed, and much of that change had been deliberately engineered by forces far away in London. The human cost of building the Madeira to Mamoré Railway is still debated by historians, but estimates of worker deaths range from several hundred to over 6,000 people. Most of those workers died from tropical disease, particularly malaria, in an era before effective treatments were widely available to construction crews working deep in the jungle. The Barbadian workers, who formed a large portion of the labor force, suffered especially badly. Far from home, working in conditions that had not been fully disclosed to them before they signed their contracts. Their stories were rarely told in the newspapers and official reports of the era, which focused on the engineering achievement rather than the human beings who paid for it with their lives and health. Back in Europe, the financial world was moving on. British bankers were already extending their reach into new regions, new industries, and new financial instruments that would define the 20th century. The Farquhar enterprise, despite its extraordinary achievement, began to unravel. Without rubber revenues, the railway could not pay for itself. Investors began to pull back. Debts accumulated. The Brazilian government, which had guaranteed certain aspects of the project, found itself in an increasingly difficult financial position as the broader economy of the Amazon region contracted sharply. Farquhar himself continued to pursue new projects across South America for decades, remaining one of the most ambitious foreign investors the continent had ever seen throughout his long career. But the Madeira to Mamoré Railway, the great symbol of what he had tried to build, began its slow decline almost as soon as it was completed and the rubber boom ended. The railway continued operating for some years, carrying whatever cargo it could find, maintaining a kind of determined existence in the jungle even as its original purpose had largely disappeared. But the deeper story of what happened was not just about a railway. It was about how global economic power can be used to shape and destroy the ambitions of entire regions. The rubber seeds that Henry Wickham removed from Brazil had set in motion a chain of events that changed the entire economic geography of the tropical world within a single generation. Brazil had once held a near monopoly on global rubber supply. Within 40 years of those seeds leaving the country, Asian plantations had completely replaced Brazilian wild rubber in world markets. The Amazon rubber economy, which had funded the railway, funded the opera houses, and funded the dreams of an entire region, collapsed so completely that some cities never fully recovered. The people of the Amazon had been rich in resources but vulnerable to a global system that was controlled from offices and boardrooms thousands of miles away from their jungle. This is a pattern that historians have documented across the 19th and 20th centuries, where local resources were extracted, the profits flowed outward, and the communities were left behind. The Madeira to Mamoré Railway was not just a failed investment. It was a monument to a particular moment in history when the ambitions of one American entrepreneur met the full weight of British imperial financial power. And the railway lost, not because it was poorly built, not because the workers were not brave enough, and not because the engineering was faulty. It lost because the commodity it was built to carry was deliberately made worthless by a competing power that had planned that outcome years in advance. That is a form of economic warfare that left no bombs and no battlefields. It left only silence, abandoned tracks, and jungles slowly reclaiming what men had built with their lives. When you stand in the Amazon today and see the rusted remains of those old railway lines, you're looking at the physical evidence of decisions made in London boardrooms more than a century ago. You're looking at what happens when the economic needs of a distant empire are allowed to override the development ambitions of a local region. The workers who died building that railway never became famous. Their names are not in most history books. Their graves were left behind in jungle clearings without ceremony or recognition. But they built something real. They moved mountains of earth, crossed rivers of fever, and laid steel through a forest that seemed determined to swallow them whole. That determination deserves to be remembered, even if the system that sent them there was driven by motives that had very little to do with the welfare of the workers themselves. The story of the Madeira to Mamoré Railway is also the story of Bolivia, a nation that dreamed of connecting itself to the world and found that dream blocked at every turn. Bolivia had already lost its only coastal territory to Chile in the War of the Pacific in 1879, leaving it permanently landlocked and dependent on neighboring countries for any access to the sea. The railway was supposed to give Bolivia a practical economic lifeline, a way to send its resources to market without having to negotiate access through hostile or indifferent neighbors. When that lifeline collapsed along with the rubber market, Bolivia was left in a position that still shapes its political and economic identity to this day, more than a century later. The landlocked status of Bolivia and its long struggle for economic independence has roots that run directly through the events of the early 20th century and the collapse of the rubber economy. Understanding the connection helps explain why Latin American countries during the 20th century often looked with suspicion at foreign investment projects, even ones that appeared to offer genuine development, because they had seen what happened when foreign money came in, built something, and then left when the economics changed, regardless of what that departure did to the people left behind. The Madeira to Mamoré Railway is a story about engineering, about ambition, about suffering, and about the invisible forces that shape what gets built and what gets destroyed in this world. And it raises a question that still matters today. When a powerful nation decides that your development threatens their interests, what tools do they use to stop you? And does anyone ever hold them responsible? Think about that as we continue into the second part of this story, because the full picture of what happened in the Amazon and who truly paid the price is even more extraordinary than what you have heard so far. The railway was built, the tracks were laid, the locomotives were running. But the world that Percival Farquhar had built it for had already been quietly and deliberately dismantled by forces he could not fight with engineering alone. What happened next in the Amazon was not just a story of one failed business venture. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself across the developing world for the next 100 years. By 1913, the price of wild Amazonian rubber had fallen by more than 70% from its peak just a few years earlier. The British plantation rubber from Malaya was flooding every market on earth. The rubber barons of Manaus, who had built marble mansions and sent their laundry to Portugal to be washed, found themselves unable to cover even their basic operating costs. The Opera House in Manaus, that magnificent symbol of jungle wealth, went quiet. The performances stopped, the audiences disappeared, the money that had made it all possible was gone. In the jungle communities along the Madeira River, the collapse was even more devastating. There were no marble mansions to sell, no savings in London banks, no fallback position of any kind. Workers who had come from Barbados, from Portugal, from Spain, from Bulgaria, found themselves stranded in the Amazon with no wages, no passage home, and no government willing to help them. The Brazilian government was itself in financial difficulty, having borrowed heavily from British banks during the rubber boom years, and now facing demands for repayment at the worst possible moment. This is where the story becomes truly uncomfortable, because the same banks that had financed the rubber boom were now the banks demanding repayment as the boom collapsed. British financial institutions held enormous amounts of Brazilian government debt, and that debt gave them influence over Brazilian economic policy that no elected government in London could have exercised openly. When Brazil needed to renegotiate its loans, the terms always seemed to favor British creditors. When Brazilian industries needed protection, British financial advisors always seemed to counsel against it. This is what historians sometimes call informal empire. It is control without occupation, influence without armies, power exercised through balance sheets and interest rates rather than through soldiers and flags. Farquhar understood this better than almost anyone. He had spent his career trying to build infrastructure in regions where informal empire operated, and he had seen its effects at close range for decades. He once described the challenge of building in Latin America as fighting, not the jungle, but the invisible hand that controlled the money behind the jungle, and never quite knew whose hand it was. By 1914, the Madeira to Mamoré Railway was running at a significant loss. The cargo volumes it had been designed to carry simply did not exist anymore. The rubber was gone from the market. Farquhar tried to diversify. He pushed for the railway to carry other goods, to open new agricultural regions, to become part of a broader Brazilian transport network that might survive the rubber collapse. Some of those efforts had limited success. Small amounts of Brazil nut cargo, timber, and agricultural produce kept the railway alive in a reduced capacity for some years after the rubber market had gone. But the economics never recovered. The railway that had cost thousands of lives and millions of dollars to build could not generate enough revenue to justify its own existence in the new economic environment. The Brazilian government eventually took control of the railway from Farquhar and his investors, adding it to the list of national infrastructure that the state was responsible for maintaining and operating. Under government control, the railway continued to function in a limited way, serving the communities along its route and maintaining a kind of stubborn presence in the jungle that refused to completely disappear. But the dream of the railway, as a great engine of regional development, as the infrastructure that would bring Bolivia and Western Brazil into the global economy on equal terms, was permanently finished. And while the railway declined, the British rubber plantation system in Malaya and Ceylon continued to expand, modernize, and dominate global rubber supply for decades to come. The story of Henry Wickham and those rubber seeds is one of the most remarkable and most debated episodes in the history of global trade, and it deserves more attention than it usually receives. Wickham arrived in the Amazon in the 1870s, a British explorer and botanical collector who was working under instructions from the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, which was funded by the British government. In 1876, Wickham collected approximately 70,000 seeds from the Hevea brasiliensis rubber tree, the species that produced the finest natural rubber in the world, and transported them to England. Brazilian law at that time technically restricted the export of rubber tree seeds, as the Brazilian government understood that its rubber monopoly depended on keeping the genetic material within its borders. Wickham later claimed that he had declared his cargo openly to Brazilian customs officials as botanical specimens for scientific study, and that he had broken no laws in removing the seeds. Brazilian historians have long disputed this account, arguing that the scale of the seed collection and the manner in which it was conducted amounted to a deliberate act of economic sabotage. Whatever the true circumstances of that day in 1876, the consequences were beyond dispute. Those seeds eventually produced the plantation rubber industry that destroyed the Amazon rubber economy within a generation. Of the 70,000 seeds Wickham brought to Kew, only about 2,800 germinated successfully. But those 2,800 seedlings were enough. They were sent to British colonies across Southeast Asia. The plantation system that grew from those seedlings was organized, efficient, and brutal in the way that colonial agricultural enterprises of that era almost always were. Workers in Malaya and Ceylon were paid extremely low wages under colonial labor arrangements that gave them very little freedom to refuse work or negotiate better terms for themselves. The low cost of that colonial labor was precisely what allowed British plantation rubber to undercut the price of Brazilian wild rubber so decisively and so completely in global markets. So the destruction of the Amazon rubber economy was built on two foundations. The first was the theft of the genetic material. The second was the exploitation of colonial labor to process it cheaply. Both of those foundations were expressions of the same imperial logic, which held that the resources of the world existed to serve the needs of the empire, regardless of who had originally held them. The people of the Amazon, the indigenous communities who had lived in the rubber forest for centuries, had no voice in any of these decisions. They were simply part of the landscape that was being reorganized. Many of those communities had already suffered terribly during the rubber boom itself, forced into debt bondage by rubber barons who used violence and control of supplies to extract labor from them. The collapse of the rubber economy ended that particular form of exploitation, but it replaced it with poverty, abandonment, and the long decline of communities that had been drawn into the cash economy and then discarded. This is one of the most painful aspects of the Amazon story. The rubber boom destroyed traditional ways of life, and then the rubber bust destroyed the new ways of life that had replaced them. The Amazon was left with nothing. No traditional economy, no rubber economy, no railway that worked at scale. Just jungle, silence, and the slow process of forgetting that followed every economic catastrophe. Back in Europe, the First World War began in 1914, and the demand for rubber accelerated again, this time driven by military vehicles, aircraft tires, and the enormous material needs of modern industrial warfare. But it was now British plantation rubber from Malaya that supplied most of that demand, not Brazilian wild rubber. The geographical shift in the rubber industry was permanent and complete. Brazil made several attempts during the 20th century to revive its rubber industry. Henry Ford famously tried to build a rubber plantation in the Amazon in the 1920s. in a project called Fordlandia. Fordlandia was one of the most extraordinary failures in the history of industrial agriculture, defeated by disease, cultural misunderstanding, and the fundamental difficulty of imposing plantation farming on wild Amazon conditions. The rubber leaf blight that devastated Fordlandia was the same reason why the Amazon rubber industry could never successfully transition to plantation farming, the way Malaya had done under controlled colonial conditions. In the Amazon, the rubber trees grew naturally dispersed across the forest, which kept the leaf blight in check. When you planted them close together in plantation rows, the blight spread and destroyed everything. This ecological reality meant that Amazonian rubber could never compete with plantation rubber on cost. The Amazon was permanently disadvantaged in its own native product by the biology of its own jungle. When you understand that, you begin to understand why the Madeira to Mamoré Railway was never going to save the Amazon rubber economy, even if it had been completed years earlier than it was. The railway could move rubber faster, but it could not change the fundamental economics that made Amazon rubber more expensive to produce than plantation rubber grown under colonial labor conditions in Southeast Asia. Britain had not just stolen the seeds, it had found the one place on Earth where those seeds could be grown in a way that made the original source permanently uncompetitive. That was the real strategic genius of it. Percival Farquhar spent the rest of his long life building and losing and rebuilding again across Latin America. He was a man who refused to accept defeat even when the evidence for it was overwhelming. He built railways in Brazil, ports in Argentina, meatpacking plants in Uruguay, and timber operations in Paraguay. He was one of the most active foreign investors the continent had ever seen across his lifetime. But he never built anything that matched the scale of ambition of the Madeira to Mamoré Railway. That project remained the defining achievement and the defining failure of his extraordinary career. He died in 1953 in New York at the age of 89, having spent 60 years trying to build the infrastructure that he believed South America deserved, but that the financial and political forces of the world kept undermining. The Madeira to Mamoré Railway outlasted him, barely. Brazilian officials eventually decided in 1972 that the railway was no longer economically viable, and closed it down, ending 60 years of struggling operation. The tracks were largely removed or left to rust. The stations were abandoned. The locomotives that had once been the symbols of human achievement over nature became monuments to economic collapse instead. Today, a short tourist section of the old railway still operates near the city of Porto Velho in the Brazilian state of Rondônia, preserved as a historical attraction and a reminder of what was once attempted there. Visitors who ride that short tourist section see old locomotives, old carriages, and old photographs of the men who built the line, men from dozens of countries who came to the Amazon and never went home. The cemetery near Porto Velho, where many of those workers were buried, is one of the most quietly powerful places in the Amazon, a field of graves belonging to men from Barbados, Spain, Bulgaria, and beyond. Those graves tell a story that the official histories of the rubber boom rarely told, which is the story of ordinary men recruited with promises of wages and adventure, and delivered instead to disease and early death. The Barbadian workers in particular occupy a special place in this story. Barbados was a British colony at that time, and many Barbadian men were recruited specifically because Britain controlled their territory and their options. The irony of British colonial subjects dying in the Amazon to build a railway that British financial interests were simultaneously working to destroy is one of the most bitter details in this entire story. Those men had no power over the forces that shaped their lives. They were caught between the ambitions of American entrepreneurs, the strategies of British imperial finance, and the indifference of governments on both sides. When you look at the history of the Madeira to Mamoré Railway, with clear eyes, you see not just an engineering story or an economic story, but a story about who pays the price when empires compete. The answer, almost always, is the people at the bottom, the workers, the indigenous communities, the small nations without armies or financial influence, the people who are never in the room where the decisions are made. Bolivia is still landlocked today. It still campaigns for access to the sea. It still feels the economic consequences of being cut off from coastal trade routes by the geography and politics of its region. The Transoceanic Highway, A modern road project connecting Brazil to Peru and the Pacific coast is the 21st century version of the dream that the Madeira to Mamoré Railway once represented for Bolivia. That highway, completed in 2011, finally gave landlocked regions of South America a land route to the Pacific. It took more than 100 years after the railway dream to achieve something close to that original vision. The economic history of the Amazon in the 20th century was largely a history of repeated extraction and repeated collapse, as one resource after another was exploited and exhausted without building lasting local wealth. Rubber gave way to timber. Timber gave way to cattle. Cattle gave way to soybeans. Each boom followed the same pattern. Capital came in, extracted value, and left the land and communities worse than before. The railway that was supposed to break that pattern instead became one of its early symbols, a monument to the difficulty of building sustainable development in a region controlled by external economic forces. Today, the Amazon faces a new version of the same old threat, as deforestation driven by agricultural and extractive industries destroys the forest that the rubber tappers once depended on for their livelihoods. The communities that live in the Amazon today are still fighting the same basic struggle that their great-grandparents fought during the rubber boom, which is the struggle to have their own resources serve their own futures. The story of the Madeira to Mamoré Railway is not just a historical curiosity. It is a lens through which you can understand everything that happened to the developing world in the 20th century. It shows you how economic power operates when it does not want to be seen, how financial decisions made in distant cities can determine the fate of communities that those decision makers will never visit. It shows you that infrastructure alone cannot save a region if the economic system surrounding that infrastructure is designed to extract rather than to develop, to take rather than to build. And it shows you that the people who actually build things, who lay the tracks and cut through the jungle and die of fever in the dark, are rarely the people who benefit when those things succeed. The engineers who designed the Madeira to Mamoré Railway were brilliant. The workers who built it were courageous. The vision behind it was genuine and potentially transformative for an entire region of the world. But vision and courage and engineering skill are not enough when the economic system within which you are operating has been shaped by powers that benefit from your failure rather than your success. That is the lesson of the Devil Road. That is what the rusted tracks in the Amazon are trying to tell anyone who stops long enough to listen to what the jungle has to say. Henry Wickham was knighted by the British government in 1920, awarded the title Sir Henry Wickham for his services to the empire. Brazil has never forgotten or forgiven what those services actually were. The contrast between how Britain remembered Wickham and how Brazil remembered him tells you everything you need to know about how the same history can look completely different, depending on where you are standing. From London, Wickham was a hero of botanical science, a man who had brought a valuable resource into the service of the empire and helped create an industry that employed millions of people across Asia. From Manaus, from the Amazon, from the communities that depended on rubber, Wickham was the man who had taken the seed of their prosperity and handed it to their competitors on a government salary. Both of those views contain truth. That is what makes the story so genuinely complicated and so genuinely important to understand, because history is almost never as simple as heroes and villains allow. The British Empire did what empires do. It used every tool available to maintain its dominance, including financial pressure, botanical theft, colonial labor, and diplomatic influence wielded quietly across decades. Farquhar did what ambitious entrepreneurs do. He saw an opportunity, pursued it with extraordinary energy, and discovered that individual ambition, however great, cannot overcome systemic power without help that never came. And the workers of the Madeira to Mamoré Railway did what ordinary people have always done in extraordinary circumstances. They showed up, they worked, they suffered, and they built something that outlasted the world that sent them there. The next time you hear about a developing nation trying to build infrastructure, trying to connect its resources to global markets, trying to break the cycle of poverty and external dependence, remember the Devil Road. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. The past holds powerful lessons and I will help you discover them.